Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Colin McInnes. I'm from the School of Engineering here at the University of Glasgow. A very warm welcome to the University of Glasgow, those of you who are joining us, and for those who were at the workshop today, a warm welcome back. The public lecture this evening is the culmination of a full day of events. We've had a one-day workshop on future cities, asking the question, do cities have limits? With really fascinating talks from visiting speakers from universities, from architectural practice, our colleagues at the Mackintosh School of Architecture, at the Glasgow School of Art. So it's been a very varied day of discussion of the idea of the city and what it means in the future. As part of the culmination of the day's events, we have a public lecture this evening, and you're very warm welcome. Just before we start, some housekeeping functions. If the fire alarm should go, then please exit through the back and through the main door to the building. At the end of the lecture, there'll be a question and answer session. There'll be a roving microphone, so please wait until the microphone arrives. And if you could, short question, please. And we can get through the Q&A session, after which there'll be a vote of thanks, and then there's a glass of wine and some soft drinks in the foyer to conclude the evening. So to kick off proceedings, it's a pleasure to invite Professor John Marsh, the head of the School of Engineering here at the University of Glasgow, to introduce our speaker this evening. John.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Jesse Ausubel to be our speaker this evening. He is the director of the Programme for the Human Environment at the Rockefeller University in New York, where he elaborates the technical vision of large, prosperous societies which minimise environmental harm and consumption of land and sea. He's recognised for quantifying the declining materials intensity of modern economies and developing the concept of dematerialisation and the broader field of industrial ecology, focusing particularly on waste reduction. He quantified potentials for technology to reduce resources demanded by agriculture, and he helped to develop the concept of decarbonisation, publishing the first paper that used the word in 1991. His interest in climate change goes back to at least 1979, when he was one of the main organisers of the first UN World Climate Conference in Geneva. He wrote much of the 1983 National Academy of Sciences report entitled Changing Climate, which was the first comprehensive review of the greenhouse effect. He's helped design and conduct major international research programmes, the most recent being the 2009 International Deep Carbon Observatory, the 2010 Census of Marine Life, and the 2015 International Quiet Ocean Experiment. He's the author or editor of 150 publications, a University Fellow of Resources for the Future, adjunct scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and member of the Foreign Affairs Board at the US Council on Foreign Relations. He served on the board of directors of the Electric Power Research Institute and as vice chair of the Richard Lounsbury Foundation. Professor Ausubel holds honorary doctorates from Dalhousie University in Canada and from the University of St Andrews here in Scotland, and he's a fellow of the American Geographical Society. Please welcome Professor Ausubel.
Thanks, Professor Marsh, Professor McInnes, and thanks to all of you from the University of Glasgow. Is this sound okay? Okay. For the opportunity to meet with you, and thanks for spending a Monday evening here in a lecture theater rather than in a pub, at least yet, or watching a football game. This is the last time I visited Glasgow was 60 years ago, when my family was spending a year in the UK. My father was a professor of British history, and he came to research John Bright, Richard Cobden, and other Victorian reformers. And we sailed across the North Atlantic on the Clyde-built ships, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. Here you see my family on the Queen Mary in 1955. And we visited the Forth Bridge, most of whose steel, of course, came from the Hallside Works of the Steel Company of Scotland near here. And these photos were taken in the summer. It was before global warming. Now, my father preferred cities like Glasgow and Rochdale, the mill towns and the market towns, to stately homes. And I would say, so do I. And to understand the nature of Glasgow, Rochdale, and I'd say all other cities, in fact, I want to take you back to some basics. Way back in 1933, a German geographer, Walter Christaller, established the basic interpretation, I would say, of the geographical distribution of human settlements. And his building stone was the village. And his view was that villages fill geographical areas with their territories. Village territories are typically about 20 square kilometers. And they fill in an area rather like hexagonal tiles, hexes, as some of you from the design school, the Glasgow Art School may say. And the tiles are about 5 kilometers in diameter, about 20 square kilometers of area. And Christaller observed that in all societies, although he looked at southern Germany, but it could have been any other part of the world, that each village possessed a set of very basic services for daily use: a bakery, a smith, a small church or shrine. And then there were less frequently used services, a shoe shop, or later a bookshop or a miller. And these would concentrate in another village that also served 6 neighboring ones. So in this bunch of 7 villages, one village would attain a kind of higher second level in the hierarchy. And this hierarchical process would continue. And in fact, at the center of 6 bunches of 7 villages, there would be another bunch with a small city, not just a market town, but a small city providing third level services, such as coopers and a court or a hospital. And the hierarchical centers would have populations increasing according to their hierarchical level. But up to about the year 1800, their physical area never exceeded that of the original village territory of 20 square kilometers. So if a village succeeded as a trading center or as a political or administrative unit, the fields would become houses and the 20 kilometers would fill to the limit. Here you see a map of Hadrian's Rome, ancient Rome. 1 million people lived in Rome at this time. But the size of the city was 20 square kilometers, and those of you who visit Rome for tourism or other purposes know that the original center is still very compact. So what had been fields and vineyards and whatever at the time of Romulus and Remus became this incredibly dense agglomeration of 1 million people. And the rules didn't change until 1800. All cities, for example, here you see a map of York in the year 1775. About 200,000 people lived inside York at that time. The rules didn't change. It was 20 kilometers of enclosed area, about 5 kilometers from one side to the other. And the reason reduces to the simple fact that people travel about 1 hour per day, and 5 kilometers are the distance one can make on foot. And until 1800, basically all cities were pedestrian cities. In the pedestrian order, the basic unit of one village had a 5-kilometer diameter. The second level of 7 villages, 7 hexi tiles, so to say, would have had a diameter of about 15 kilometers, with 1 tile in the center and 6 around. And going to the next level of 49 tiles, you'd have a diameter of about 15 kilometers. Now, introducing mechanical transport changes the scale of the base. Here you see a slide which shows the introduction of increasing speed. Introducing mechanical transport changes the scale of the base from the pedestrian city. And of course, as you do this, the lower hierarchical levels disappear, melting into single units with sizes corresponding to the size of the dominant speed of the dominant mode of transport. Cars, for example, have a mean speed of about 40 kilometers per hour, so that a car society, like Los Angeles most famously, dissolves the first two levels of organization. Gradually, well, not so gradually in the case of Los Angeles because it was really built around the car, but societies that had a prior structure and gradually adopt motorization see the old structures melt away. Now, of course, in most landscapes, especially in a place like Europe, you have a hybrid. Now, there's a logic to this proposed over the years by various scholars. An engineer, John Virarakis, did some very interesting studies in which he looked at minimization of energy, and he proposed that the city organization is the outcome of interactions between economic operators on the one hand, who provide services, and the residents who use them. And of course, the object of the economic operator is to survive, but the residents want to minimize the effort that they use to reach the services with appropriate frequency. And the final result of a kind of trial and error process where services such as shops open up more or less stochastically and close if they're not sufficiently patronized leads to an internal organization of a city with quarters or boroughs, in a sense like villages, with different population densities, and again organized into clusters of 7. So the central borough in a city serves the surrounding ones for the less frequently used services. And again, the clusters organize hierarchically, and this distribution of services appears to minimize the total length of trips, or rather travel time, as I'll explain, for the population relative to any other distribution. So the total traveling for using facilities is constant and independent of size in the sense of population. So we can say that structure is preserved over a range of scales. Human settlements have this kind of fractal quality. And 10 times more inhabitants do not use 10 times more area. In fact, size is inversely proportional to local population, meaning the density decreases exponentially in cities from the center. And the consequence is that the city centers are very small, so that all the facilities are at a short distance. I come from Manhattan, and Manhattan is very practical for people like me who live there. For amusement, here's a new biotech service provided in New York City. You may have food trucks in Glasgow. There are now DNA trucks in New York City. And you can have your DNA tested to see if you're maybe prone to diabetes or to check whether you should fight a court case on paternity. I don't know whether the Roslin Institute has incubated similar services here at Glasgow, or some of you students may consider it. Well, I mentioned that people travel about an hour per day, and now let's build an anthropological foundation. At the most basic level, hominids, us, are animals who operate from a protected refuge, originally a cave. We try to minimize the time we search and maximize the efficiency of foraging. And we also seek to re-enter the cave at night. Basically, exposure is dangerous. And it turns out that in all societies since ever, humans average a bit more than an hour of daily traveling. Current studies show that averaged over the entire population, travel time is about 70 minutes per day, but for convenience for the remainder of the talk, let's call it an hour. And here you see a range of studies done for a range of societies. The very high end are the Californians, who also eat and bank in their cars and listen to books on tape. They don't really want to spend more than 70 minutes traveling. The Japanese, who do very careful studies and also have very good mass transit systems, I think are right about the mean at 70 minutes. Some societies are a bit lower. One has to be a little careful about believing the German efficiency. Sometimes they exaggerate. Well, there is some spread, but and it depends on age, occupation, and other variables. But overall, it's less than what people might well expect. And following a great transportation scientist, Yakov Zahavi, we call this the travel time budget, the TTB, the travel time budget. And it's actually well established by many surveys. And those of you who read the transportation science literature, you know, every few years there'll be an update on this, and it will come back to the hour, 70 minutes as the travel time budget. Well, interestingly, people also have a travel money budget. And again, there have been lots of studies about this in a range of different societies. And about 15% of disposable income tends to be used to finance movement. Again, there are different ways of measuring this. It depends on whether the fraction of taxes and public money that goes for transport is allocated. It depends on how honest people are in their reporting. But let's say, again, somewhere between 12 and 15% of disposable income tends to go for as the travel money budget. And there's also an underlying logic for this, potentially, which is that people spend about 8 hours a day engaged in, let's say, consumption kinds of activities. So if you spent about 1/8 of your time traveling, then it makes sense that you spend about 1/8 of your disposable income on movement. And interestingly, even when there's a very tough recession, it hardly makes a dent. Here you see data for the U.S. on the travel money budget this is percent of GDP, which would be a little lower than percent of disposable income. And in the grayish blue, it's the total amount. And in red, it's the percent of GDP. And you see at the 2008-2009 recession, there was a temporary drop, but by 2011, Americans were back to spending their travel money budget. Okay, so we have a travel time budget, we have a travel money budget, and basically what happens is that people allocate time and money between different modes of transport in such a way as to maximize distance, the size of their territory. A larger territory offers more resources. And again, we would argue this is just very basic animal behavior. People are trying to maximize their access to resources, and they'll allocate their time and money in order to do so. Now, because travel time is fixed, the 70 minutes or so, the hour, people use money to buy speed. I'll come back to this several times in the talk. The number of trips per day oscillates between about 3 for people in cities up to 4 or 5 for people in villages in the countryside. Let's focus on the 3 trips per day that are typical of, would be typical of the people in this room. And the main trip is from home to work or school. And this round trip may use on average, say, 50 of the 70 minutes daily. The second and third trips are typically for shopping and for social contact, say to buy a loaf of fresh bread and to go to the pub. Now, in addition to the main daily round trip to work or school, from time to time a longer trip is needed, usually for business. And because a working day can last 12 to 14 hours, or at least in the Victorian era, at least 4 or 5 hours need to be dedicated to the business proper. And inclusive travel time in each direction thus can only be 3 to 4 hours door to door if one is to make it home for the night. So it takes, let's say, up to 3 to 4 hours to get somewhere. You can do your business for 4 or 5 hours, then it takes 3 or 4 hours to get home, and everything is well in the animal brain. Practically speaking, because of safety checks at airports and so forth, the high-speed part can't really last more than about 1.5 hours, which in turn establishes another spatial hierarchy. To give an example, the city of Paris has access to more than 100 million people by short flights that allow return the same day. The key for cities, and this is true for Glasgow as well, the key is how many flights one has with other members of the nucleus. And obviously cities like Paris and London have a tremendous advantage in terms of their reach with flights that in an hour and a half can reach many other millions of people. Now, amazingly, travel patterns are invariant with regard to income or level of development, culture, nationality, and religion. So again, we would argue that it's very basic anthropology at work. But with increasing income, which most societies have enjoyed at least for the last couple of hundred years, the distance traveled increases quite regularly, say 3% per year. And meanwhile, of course, technology increases the modes or options for travel. In round numbers, again, walking is about 5 kilometers an hour. Cars, let's say, at round numbers, 50 kilometers an hour, a factor of 10 faster. And planes, again, in round numbers, let's say 500 kilometers an hour, yet an order of magnitude faster. And in a study we did in the 1990s, we found that income and technology had compounded the mobility of Americans almost 3% per year for over 100 years, from about 5 kilometers daily at the start in 1880. Basically, Americans were walking. A small fraction of Americans had horses. We gradually walked less. Now we only walk about 1 kilometer a day. Trains came in and did pretty well for a while, and then faded off. But the automobile came in, and then air. And so if you add together all the kilometers you travel every year, that you walk, that you go by bicycle, that you go on a horse, that you go in a car, a bus, a train, and in planes, you find that the average American or the average French person, and I'm sure it would be the same in Scotland, has gradually increased mobility. And I would guess here it's probably also about 3% per year. So the greater income allows you to buy greater speed. Now, speed is expensive, both because faster machines like horses and planes have always been more expensive than the slower ones per kilometer, but especially because people travel in time, theme that I'll return to, and in the same time they make more kilometers. So even if cars and planes more or less cost the same per kilometer, a plane costs 10 times as much per hour. Now, all this means that a city is a spatial structure invariant to travel time. For a given city, the travel time structure is basically independent of its spatial evolution. Modern urbanization is a spatial reorganization driven by faster transport technologies. A city is a time structure more than a geometrical one. And we can define a city simply as the conurbation inside which people move daily. City size is determined by the longest trip done with the fastest means of transportation in about half an hour. In other words, the diameter of a city will be about 1 hour transit time by the fast mode from one side to the other. The center is the area of maximum accessibility for the maximum number of persons. Historically, that's physically or geographically also been the city center. As we'll discuss later, it may be that the new city center is now the airport. Definitions of center and periphery are also not geographic, but temporal. To summarize, human settlements are organized to provide hierarchical contacts in a time frame of about 1 hour. The parameter that transfers this organization into space is transport speed, and the speed is actually the independent variable regulating the entire system. Let me say a little bit more about modes of travel. As we've said, travel centers in the home, and it extends into a range depending on the speed of transport available and the disposable income. We have the travel time budget of about an hour. And the speed that can be extracted from the transport system, from the engineering, thus defines the structure of human settlements. Importantly, speed means inclusive speed, a bit like inclusive fitness in Darwinian terms. Inclusive speed or speed spans the time from when the traveler leaves home to when she or he walks into the office, including, for example, minutes spent waiting for a bus or searching for parking. I think a lot of errors in transport strategy and planning have neglected to think of inclusive travel time. Saving time waiting or parking is just as good as more horsepower in that sense. Or similarly with airports, it really, if you can reduce the amount of time you spend in an airport waiting room, that's just as good as the plane going 200 kilometers an hour faster. Well, as I've said, with growing wealth, technology introduces faster means, and the new modes are faster but usually not cheaper. So at the outset, most travelers can't rush to use them. Rather, the new means gradually capture the market as people can afford more, as they come to be familiar with how a new system operates, and as the system itself improves in many directions. Cars are a famous example of this. Cars were faulty in many ways. The tires punctured frequently. There were no windshield wipers. So with all new technologies, trains, planes, cars, and so forth, the first decade or two or even three is always rough as the edges are smooth. So the picture is slow penetration of new technologies of transport, adding speed in the course of substituting for the old ones in terms of time allocation. Let me just say a little bit more about the modes. Walking, as I mentioned, Americans now walk only about 1 kilometer per day. Amazingly, in France, mechanical mobility equaled walking only during the 1920s. So in 1920, you would, in the course of a year, if you lived in France, you covered as many kilometers on foot as you would have on a horse or in a railroad. Now, in addition to walking, there's running. It's tiring, but it is 3 or 4 times faster than walking, and it's actually quite reliable for the able-bodied at least. High speed lasts only an hour or two, but it can be very useful for those who do it. And in fact, some societies, the Incas most famously, the New World, of course, didn't have horses. The Incas sustained their empire for centuries with runners on foot, and relays of runners could reach the furthest point from the capital in 2 weeks of relays. Well, horses can run faster and longer than people. They can sustain about 20 kilometers per hour for several hours per day and reach a peak speed of almost 50 kilometers per hour for a few minutes. And horses topped transport for a few thousand years, actually. They allowed the sovereign to send and receive messages, and they certainly influenced the kingdom in which you lived. They made big empires for the Romans, the Chinese, the Huns. And in a few places, horses also greatly expanded personal territory. The horse is the symbol of the American West, and horses were cheap in the United States because they didn't compete with people for land for food. And one could say that horses actually established the low price of a gallon of gas in the US. And the vast American West was quickly divided into territories controlled by ranchers, farmers, and Native Americans, Indians, all with horses. But in general, horses were very expensive and in fact severely limited their use. Horses were really a luxury for the wealthy. So in most places, they made no impact on the basic structure of human settlements. They did create famous challenges of pollution, and they created many jobs. Well, trains, though. Trains were much more successful. Trains commercialized about 1830. Many of the locomotives manufactured here, of course, in Glasgow. And then motor cars, first produced in the 1890s. So the trains and the motor cars displaced the horses. Canals, by the way, were basically a horse technology. Horses and mules pulled barges on towpaths. But we've had the succession of canals, then rails, then paved roads, and more recently airways, occupying shares of the overall length of the transport infrastructure of countries such as Britain, France, and America. And you can think of this total infrastructure as a gradually expanding pie, but in which the slices of the pie are competing for your business as travelers. Well, we may think of trains as fast, but in practice, their inclusive speed has always been slow because of the travel to and from stations, changes, stops, and serpentine routes. I traveled by train yesterday from Lukers to Glasgow. It's a distance of 105 kilometers, and the segment on the train lasted 162 minutes, or about 40 kilometers an hour. And the inclusive travel time was even slower because I needed to take a taxi to Lukers and then a taxi from the train station here to near the university. In Europe today, most of the intercity trains still average only about 60 kilometers an hour, measured as the air distance between stops. And even in Germany, again perceived as efficient, the average speed of trains is only about 65 kilometers an hour, with a peak around 100. Now, a TGV, a French TGV, may reach 400 kilometers an hour, but the inclusive speed is perhaps half of that. So the greatest effect of trains in terms of settlements has actually been in regions where distances of, say, 100 kilometers mattered greatly. Well, compared to railroads, cars have the great advantage of no waiting time and no mode change, offset in some places by parking shortages. But one can say, in effect, of cars that they have infinite frequency. In practice, cars are about 8 times as fast as pedestrians. Their mean speed is about 40 or 50 kilometers an hour, combining inter and intracity. Public vehicles such as buses go about 20 kilometers an hour or 10 kilometers an hour in Midtown Manhattan. Well, if you expand in linear space 8 times, if you go from 5 kilometers on foot to 40 kilometers on a car, then your area expands by 64 times the area. So cars thus expand your territory, the individual's territory, from about the 20 kilometers of your original hexi on foot to 1,200 square kilometers or more if you have a license. So suddenly your world goes from 1 village to 60 villages in terms of area. And the car, again, effectively wipes out 2 levels in the former hierarchy of settlements that we discussed at the outset. So the car instantly reshuffles 60% of the population into large urban areas, and we see the consequences with motorization basically having the same consequence for urbanization everywhere in the world. Now, interestingly, in the US and most other places, the annual distance that a car travels each year has remained about the same. In the US, about 16,000 kilometers a year since 1935. And the time a car works each day has also remained about an hour. So you can do very simple arithmetic, which means that since the car has gone about the same distance and about the same time, it means that the average speed of a car has stayed constant at about 40 kilometers an hour in the US. So all the horsepower, all the fins, all the efforts in the 1950s to make cars look like airplanes, all of these things, in fact, really have make no difference to speed. Cars may be safer, they may have radios, they may have air conditioning, but they really haven't changed our mobility since early in their introduction. Now, by the way, this being Glasgow, it's interesting to remark that sailing was just walking on water. A typical 19th century sailing ship from Glasgow to Boston took about 50 days for the 5,000 kilometers, or about 4 kilometers per hour. In 1912, the Titanic averaged about 30 kilometers per hour and peaked at just under 40. The steamship Queen Mary achieved average speed equal to a car, about 40 to 50 kilometers an hour. So you can think of the Queen Mary as driving across the North Atlantic. Now, maritime transport did smartly reduce friction, and it also smoothed coastlines and other terrestrial impediments. So for shipping and freight, it was extremely important, and most goods today still spend time on the water. And of course, really it was seawater that made Glasgow great. Alas for Glasgow, as well as Liverpool, Belfast, and many other ports, flying finesses the problem by smoothing Earth itself, elevating to levels where the mountains and valleys don't interfere. For animals, flying is energetically cheaper than running, but requires extremely sophisticated design. Flying has a fixed high energy cost because support is dynamic. One must push air down to stay up, and the energy cost thus depends on time in flight and penalizes slow machines. So the successful machines, air machines, tend to be fast. The mean speed of a plane, as mentioned earlier, is perhaps 600 kilometers per hour, or 500 for an inclusive travel time with takeoff and landing, an order of magnitude faster than intercity trains. And I would say it was really aerospace companies that nearly killed Glasgow, not London nor unions. During the past 70 years, passenger kilometers for planes have increased by a factor of 100. The United Arab Emirates, with a population about the same as Scotland, has invested massively in aviation infrastructure, and in 2014, Dubai International Airport became the world's busiest, with 70 million total passengers. Nearby Doha and Abu Dhabi rank 20th and 30th globally. Nations and cities need to play in the air game to be at the top level. We could go into side stories of bicycles and other vehicles, but suffice it to say that low-cost speed is what brings success. Successful infrastructures diminish substantially the time of travel. Now let me go back to cities a bit more. Why would there be this hierarchy of cities? It could be these theories of, again, some kind of theory of efficiency of energy, time travel. An idiosyncratic American statistician named George Kingsley Zipf put together a great book in the late 1940s called Human Behavior and the Principle of Least Effort. And he collected data showing that populations of cities follow very simple rules, basically a Pareto distribution or a discrete power law probability distribution. And one of his most powerful examples here shows the growth of the rank size distribution of American cities from 1790 to 1930. The top city grew from about 50,000 inhabitants in 1790 to about 8 million in 1930, and the ranks, the number of cities on the horizontal axis, grew from about a dozen to 5,000. And you can see that from a bumpy beginning, a very smooth hierarchy emerged. The system wins. As a linguist, Zipf noted that in dozens of languages where he made rank frequency charts, a few words occur very often and most rarely. More specifically, the second word occurs approximately half as often as the first, the third about a third as often as the first, and so on. And in his book, when he made these rank size distributions for cities, he found a similar result. And he proffered this principle of least effort as a possible explanation. In the case of languages, neither speakers nor listeners using a language want to work harder than they need to understand one another, and the process results in about equal distribution of effort, which turns into a Zipf distribution. And this resembles the idea mentioned earlier for the hierarchical distribution of services in cities. Now, so we live in this world of hierarchies of villages and towns and cities, and in turn we live in a world of hierarchies of cities. Now, usually a large population corresponds to a higher hierarchical level. Functionally, the area commanded by the influence of a city, however, depends on the speed of means of transport. Thus, it's important to appreciate that the population of a city is not just a statistic. a large city can afford a large hierarchy of specializations, providing dominance in the competition with other cities. In the long run, the largest becomes the dominant one, or perhaps vice versa. Well, ponder some estimates of Europe's largest cities since the year 1000. You have to take these estimates cautiously because obviously the census in Palermo in the year 1000 may not have been completely accurate, nor indeed in St. Petersburg in 1900. And there are arguments about using metropolitan areas versus city limits. Still, one point that comes through very clearly is that how dynamic the world system is with regard to cities. They rise and fall in rank. And of special interest, of course, is that Glasgow attained the 9th rank here in 1900. And if a city has the drive to grow, the most modern means of transport provide the tools. And of course, in 1900, Glasgow had the rails and the ships. To compete in the European region, clearly Glasgow, looking forward, Glasgow and environments need to operate as a larger city, which means you need speed. Well, I've spoken about future cities and their limits. What's to come, then? And I've hinted at it. New forms of transport enter the game. First, it's important to say the flying game is still young. In 2015, Americans on average flew about 70 seconds per day, as you see in this slide. The Japanese flew on average about 20 seconds per day, and Europeans probably about the same. It's harder to calculate the statistics because the EU keeps changing and some of the borders keep changing. The world average last year was about 12 seconds. That's easier to calculate because the International Air Transport Association keeps information on the totality of flights, the totality of passenger kilometers, the totality of passengers. People in India and China fly only 1 or 2 seconds per day. Now, 3 minutes per day would equal about 1 round trip per month for a Glaswegian to London or Amsterdam, and that certainly seems feasible for the average Scot, let's say, a generation from now. And in fact, during 2015, I flew about 165 hours, or about 25 minutes per day, and I'm not even a top-level frequent flyer. So in a world in which it's obviously you can fly 25 minutes a day as a professor. The average American flies 70 seconds per day. The average Japanese person is flying 20 seconds per day. The average Indian or Chinese is flying 1 or 2 seconds per day. The air system is young in terms of traffic. Now, also the cost of, in real terms, of air transport is decreasing, so a larger stratum could allocate some share of its money budget to this mode. For the European air system, the projected level requires an order of magnitude increase in the next 25 years, or about 12% per year, a hard pace to sustain without a very basic rethinking of airplanes, airports, and logistics. Well, top planes could meet the productivity. If we used the Japanese fly A380s as shuttles between Tokyo and Osaka, as do the Brazilians between Sao Paulo and Rio, and perhaps one could do that between Glasgow or Edinburgh and London, or between Glasgow and Edinburgh. But it makes more sense to save the big aircraft for intercontinental travel. At the continental range, also the big aircraft introduced problems of noise. So there's this, and in Europe, of course, many of the distances are, let's say, 500 to 1,000 kilometers separating the large continental cities. Thinking of the A380, the jumbo jet example, if one had about 10 million, if one has 10 million passengers per year per direction, that's 30,000 passengers per day. And that would require 60 takeoffs and landings of A380s, which would be a lot to add on to already congested airports. Moreover, these planes, if they're using current engines, would use a lot of the fuel in the transport system, which would be interesting to the transport providers, but also to environmentalists. Basically, jet fuel is kerosene, CH2, and it may not pass environmental tests at future air traffic volumes. So we need a high-density mode of transport having the performance characteristics of top airplanes without the problems. And according to our studies, the best bet is on magnetically levitated systems, or maglevs. Trains, one can say, with magnetic suspension and propulsion. Maglevs would form the fifth great infrastructure following canals, paved roads, and airports. Here you see an example from California, promoted by the entrepreneur Elon Musk. He's frustrated with the travel between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and he's frustrated with plans to put in a conventional slow train, or fast train by American standards, but slow by the ability to go back and forth and do business in the same day. And so he's proposed this so-called Hyperloop train, which is basically a maglev inside an evacuated tube, elevated over highways, that goes 1,000 kilometers an hour. The maglev is a vehicle without wings, without wheels, without motor, and without combustibles aboard. It's suspended magnetically between two guardrails that resemble an open stator of an electric motor, and it can be propelled by a magnetic field that can either run in front and drag it or push it from behind. Hard limits to the speed of maglevs don't really exist if the maglev runs in an evacuated tunnel or surface tube. One should say the technology of maglevs, first you can experience it between Shanghai Airport and downtown Shanghai, or in Korea, or some amusement parks. Some of the roller coasters and amusement parks are now linear motors, maglevs. So they're entering the system kind of orthogonally. I mentioned this idea of the succession of the great infrastructures, and this is a slightly idealized view of the development of infrastructures in the US over time. In the inset, you see the actual length in kilometers of canals, rails, paved roads, and now air routes added together as all binary air routes. And you see the canals, the midpoint of the building of canals was about 1836, rail about 1890, paved roads about 1946. We think we've probably, in the US at least, probably passed the midpoint of the construction of the air system, and we hypothesize, or hope, that maglevs may be the next great infrastructure. Now, I mentioned vacuum or partial vacuum, and that's really the key. At present, all the vehicles move within a fluid, dissipating most of the energy used to propel them. The needed breakthrough is to run the vehicles in evacuated tubes or tunnels. Evacuated space is expensive, but offers high speed. And by evacuated, we mean something similar to the low pressure that an airplane encounters at 10 to 15,000 meters of altitude. Tunnels solve the problem of permanent landscape disturbance, but tubes mounted above existing right-of-way of roads or rails might prove easier and cheaper to maintain. An interesting fact is that going back to horses, there's been a so-called rule of the ton. That is, transporting a person requires about a ton of vehicle. So a horse plus a person, or a railroad cars with people divided appropriately into the average traffic, or automobiles, or aircraft. There's about a ton of metal and plastic and glass and wood, or horse flesh per passenger. But maglevs, because they don't have the engines, and because they don't have to carry any fuel, belly fat, if you think of a plane flying overhead, it's really very much like a fat goose with carrying its fuel. Maglevs are not burdened by all the extra weight. And the result is the maglev system can inherently be much, much more efficient. If you only need 300 kilos of structure to carry 300 kilos of passenger or passengers, that's much better than the 1,000. So it could be drastically more efficient. Now, one of the concerns, of course, is that maglevs might make us sprawl, and it's a legitimate fear. Even in Europe, we've seen the tripling of the average speed of travel with automobiles and the suburbanization of Europe, not as much as in America, but still, if you go to places like Denmark or Sweden, it's obviously moved in that direction. But maglevs might offer the alternative of a kind of bimodal or virtual city with pedestrian islands and fast connections between them. You can imagine, in effect, maglev metros at the scale of the UK or at the scale of the United States or the scale of Europe. Now, looking far into the 21st century, and our theme is the future, we can imagine really quite a wondrous system. Charles Rolls and Henry Royce met in Manchester in 1904 and probably didn't foresee the system of motorways. Well, if you really begin to think about the maglev system, essentially you're just moving a set of magnetic bubbles around under the control of a central computer, and you could actually start in a skyscraper or any kind of vertical structure. The maglev could start as an elevator. It could take you down, and that could then enter into the horizontal system and zoom around and go into another high-rise structure and right to its destination. So it could be kind of like, eventually it could be like a sort of super video game of vehicles moving around at very high speed with very high utilization in the way that the internet allows. Now, coming back to Scotland, it would seem to me a logical step, of course, is to speed traffic between Glasgow and Edinburgh, especially between their airports and then later to London. It's very important to appreciate that the airport now forms the fulcrum of intercity transport, as the train station did 100 years ago. Thus, the intracity transport net, in particular the subway, must absorb the airport and tie to it in a very fast manner, I would say 10 minutes, if we want to keep rolls for city centers. Otherwise, I think all over the world we face the likelihood that over the next few decades the airports really will replace the old city centers as the city centers. If the city centers want to keep the airports in some sense subjugated, they need to put in very high-speed links. Well, for the next 30 years or so, air will continue penetrating the hour of travel, if not up to 25 minutes a day, I think up to 3 or 4 minutes a day for a lot of people, and that'll augment the mobility, and I think everything really needs to be conceived around the airports. In fact, the distance between Glasgow and Edinburgh airports is only 80 kilometers. If the journey from Glasgow to Edinburgh takes about 20 minutes, then the system becomes a single city. And the speed could in fact be achieved even by the regular TGV operating at 240 kilometers an hour. The combined cities, just the council areas, would be 1.1 million inhabitants and move to a higher rank in Britain and in Europe. But why not innovate and lead? Why not go with the even faster maglev and link the airports in 10 minutes and allow the combined metro areas of the two cities, the Central Belt in effect, totaling about 3.1 million people, to function as a single city. The maglevs could go between the airports in 5 minutes. And this would in fact restore the region to about 10th place in Europe and second in the British Isles. Now, speaking of Britain, 6 million people fly yearly between the 5 London airports in Glasgow and Edinburgh. There are about 660 flights a week, and it's about 1/6 of all the takeoffs and landings. And these would be fine routes for maglevs, initially at 600 kilometers an hour, later faster if one can build the evacuated tubes, and they would allow the easy same-day returns. And the present traffic could fill a maglev from each city every hour from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. with 500 passengers. Moreover, relieving the combined airports of 6 of the 20 million passengers who now use them, and 1/6 of all takeoffs and landings, would in turn allow aviation to grow more readily, in particular to Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Paris, and other continental hubs that are less than 2 hours away, and again allow same-day returns. In short, maglevs in aviation can allow Scotland's Central Belt to operate at a high level, both in Scotland and in Europe. The limit, I would say, is indecision to invest. Now, naturally, we ask in the era of smartphones whether the explosion of telecommunications substitutes partly or totally for the travel. And the answer is telecom does not interfere at all with the quantity of travel, but does modify the objectives. Travel is born in our instinct to use the means that technology allows to reach our objective of maximizing territory or access to resources. The wired city can eliminate the component number one of travel to work, the 50 minutes or 35 kilometers per day for car owners. However, if we work from home, we immediately absorb the travel time with more trips for social or leisure purposes. Ditto when we shop from home. Moreover, travel extends contact spatially and thus extends also the necessity of telecom. They enjoy parallel growth. In fact, it's not at all clear to me that people will abandon the office. In the case of finance, for example, important in New York, the system operates in an abstract electronic way all over the world, but the operators in principle could be completely delocalized. But in fact, bankers continue to choose to aggregate in New York, London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and a few other cities. The desire for personal contact continues to create the opportunities for cities to succeed. And by the way, telecommuting also does not spare petrol. The internet surely lifts the efficiency of foraging, but the necessity remains for personal contact, that is travel, to arrange and operate the necessary contracts of life. The travel time budget gets spent. The Netherlands has done a lot of studies on this, hoping that they would save fuel by having people telecommute and work at home, but of course it just meant that people made more trips to shop or to visit their friends. Well, let me say a little bit more about cars, or cars enriched with information. Cars are not well suited for densely populated cities. The basic and growing incompatibility expresses itself in expanding areas where cities limit car entry or parking. London famously now deprives itself of traffic. Now, happily, the share economy may provide a way forward. As we've seen, a car is used on average only about 50 minutes per day. Immense capital sits wastefully for 23 hours. In the US, the beginning of a plateau in the population of cars and light trucks suggests we are approaching peak car. And there have been a number of studies about which we heard earlier today, the same kinds of information for the UK. And the reason may be that drone taxis are poised to win market share. While the average personal vehicle motors about an hour per day, a car shared like a Zipf car gets used 8 or 9 hours per day, and a taxi even more. BMW and Daimler have recently entered the car sharing business with enterprises called Reach Now and Car2Go. Some of you may have used them. I think there'll be the world of the romantic world of James Bond as a driver, or the romantic world in America of Jack Kerouac driving across country. Is 50 years from now, people will look back on the 50s and 60s and scratch their heads. It'll seem as remote as horses. Moreover, the driverless cars can work tirelessly and safely and accomplish the present mileage with many fewer vehicles. Fewer vehicles also means less steel, less rubber, less iron. And if the streets could be substantially cleared of parked cars, then in fact speed itself could rise and thus mobility. And efficient routing with GPS also of the driverless car will spare petrol and pollution. And if the cars operate on fuel cells or perhaps batteries, urban air quality issues will likely also be a subject of nostalgia, like the fogs from burning wood and coal. The no talk on mobility would be complete in cities without drones. And drones, of course, can come by air as well as by land. Here you see drone delivering pizza. And in fact, aerial delivery also could reduce surface traffic and further lift ground speed and help the central city. Now, in fact, planes started by carrying only the mail and a few pricey people, but they've progressively captured lower value goods, and the largest air freighters now carry about 200 tons, which is a lot of pizza. And with an increase in traffic, in fact, old and new airframe companies, including here in the UK, are designing a variety of airships for freight. Blimps, Redux, 1,000 tons seems technically portable. And air freighters could revolutionize cargo transport and reduce the role also of the road in long-distance distribution of goods, and also help in building high, dense cities from above, from the sky. More generally, I think we're likely to see a progressive subtraction of freight from trucks and a stabilization of ton kilometers, and the confinement of trucks to local retailing. And this fits with the trend toward air freight and what Professor Marsh mentioned, the larger trend toward dematerialization, especially in cities. The idea of dematerialization simply means that value added per unit of weight keeps increasing. So what needs to be delivered in some sense may be more easily delivered. It's worth saying a little bit about walking, personal prostheses. There could be a renaissance of walking or a kind of substitution in walking. These wouldn't actually make us go faster than brisk walkers, but there may be people who want to use hoverboards and other kinds of mechanical prostheses to go from their 1 or 2 kilometers up to their 4 or 5. Or if you're living in a district, you might want to use one of these to get to your maglev station. I assume the hoverboard craze has reached Scotland, and this part of it relies on the same magnet technology that's propelling maglevs, and there could be other creative outlets at the individual level. And even more promising, I think, is the personal scooter or power wheelchair. This is an area of explosive experimentation. Here you see 16 young or startup companies on the left that are interested in producing these, and some of them look like Nortons or Harley Davidsons, these could be extremely important. Again, it's not so much that they would add speed, but there may be a large fraction of the population for whom this allows mobility who might otherwise have it. People born today can be expected to live to between 108 and 112. So in societies, urbanized societies with great longevity, devices like these could wonderfully ease the isolation of people, just as Skype and email do. Well, so let me say a little bit about the social climate, entrepreneurs. The entrepreneur irreplaceably contributes to renewal of social systems, but is not necessarily loved or even appreciated. In Russia, in some of the Slavic cultures, they're called spekulant, which is a really kind of insulting word for a speculator. Well, I think we have to go back to Darwin. Darwin rightly described the struggle for life as brutally selective. The gene pool incorporates perhaps 1% of biological mutations. In the ocean, perhaps there are perhaps 100 to 1,000 kinds of small single-cell organisms for each larger organism that ends up with a Latin binomial like Homo sapiens. So these enormous ratios are somehow tied to a stochastic process of exploration where there's a huge price to pay in the evolution of the system. And economists will say that their reality resembles the biological reality. Perhaps 3% of new products survive on the shelf of a supermarket after 6 months. And entities in every new sector, from search engines to rap music, have high rates of mortality. In the capitalist system, we can think of the entrepreneur as a kind of kamikaze with an impetus for self-exaltation who sacrifices himself to open new ways for the squadron that follows. Well, high-risk entrepreneurs will sensibly slip away from areas where the social and political climate is invidious or jealous or bureaucratic or conservative. Repression of speculators, in fact, was a fundamental cause of the weakness of the planned economies a generation ago. They didn't accept enough or celebrate taking risks. Now, in fact, entrepreneurs really are basically communicators. What they do is put together information, people, things from all around the world, and they need an agile and efficient system of transport for information, people, and things to stimulate their enterprise. I'd say an airport is essential. And the dimensions of the city are essential. In this case, I mean the number of inhabitants because of possible specialization. In a village, there's a small shop, which you may find a little of everything. But in a larger city, in a place like Glasgow or London, there are incredibly specialized businesses. And the availability both of choice, but also sophisticated advice from expert sellers lifts the chance of winning choices by entrepreneurs who inevitably know little of everything. Now, Glasgow, with its 500,000 inhabitants, at least in the council area, is small in the concert of great European cities, and this size does inhibit access to advanced parts of innovation. But we've suggested this way out, the way out in terms of the high-speed transport and trying to turn the Central Belt into a more unified community, in effect, a kind of super city. And Glasgow historically, of course, produced John Brown and Charles Rennie Mackintosh, more recently Bell and Sebastian. And in lieu of ships and locomotives, why not produce magnetically levitated vehicles and mobile scooters? Obviously, opportunities will abound also for construction in 3 dimensions, another subject that we talked about today, 3-dimensional 3D printing. Nature already does it with flowers and fruit, but humans are just learning. Infinite demand obviously continues for information handling, not to mention brewing. Well, this region has great traditions in banking, publishing, education, and other industries that I think actually would seem to fit with what's to come. Let me say a little bit about beauty and density. Density does not in itself have negative effects, notwithstanding experiments on crowded rats. What matters first is to make the small space available extremely pleasant, as, for example, the crowded Japanese have done. And second, I think this is very important, one must provide the hierarchy of personal and group privacy that old cities realized with internal courts and with small squares or piazzas. Most important is the home, where people spend 2/3 of all their time, averaged over a week. Le Corbusier, the Swiss-French architect, whom I regard as one of the great criminals of the 20th century, wrote that a house is a machine for living. And indeed, the drawback of modern cities is that they're rarely built to the measure of humanity. Rather, they tend to be a patchwork of machines to live in. Glasgow had its Le Corbusier, Sir Basil Spence, who bulldozed the Gorbals and built the brutalist Queen Elizabeth Square flats in Hutchison Town. Medieval cities, now preciously restored, held the secrets, intricate personal links and beauty. They matched density with human demands. And now we can do what medieval or Victorian builders could not with services like water supply and wastewater and, of course, electricity, heating, and chilling. We can aim for truly 3-dimensional or cathedral cities made of abundant materials such as stones, polished or upgraded, for example, into foamed glass. And in the cities, we can reconstruct nature sublimated in art. As I've suggested, an accessible center is key. An inaccessible center ceases to be a center. Life drains from it. There's been a lot of misguided pedestrianization unless you complement the pedestrianization with mass transit that allows people to get to the city center. You have no blood and no life. I would also say that polycentricity means the city has been unable to solve its transport or accessibility problems to the satisfaction of users. What happens is that the periphery develops the functions of the center. This has happened in a number of US cities, and you end up with what the Germans, the Dutch call a Randstadt, or an edge city. And as far as I'm concerned, this is de-optimized. Now, importantly, the mode of transport, and whether it's public or private, I don't think matters. Only low-cost speed. People are ready to accept the inconveniences of public travel if there's a marginal speed gain over private transport. Now, conversely, people are attracted to beauty, which can also calm agitation. It may seem Victorian or Edwardian, but I believe key personnel involved with traffic and transport should wear glorious uniforms, appropriate for those who bestow speed. Interestingly, gender parity may help in this regard. During World War I opened occupations in security and in transport to women for the first time, and one result was good appearance. Well, I'm confident the Glasgow School of Art could do even better, but I feel like the sort of general degeneration of the way people look at airports, on trains, buses, planes is a kind of sad thing. We should be doing a lot better and really putting mobility where it belongs. Now, where does all this leave green nature? Sunny Californians spend only 5% of their time, or about 70 minutes each day, outside. And in fact, as Scots know, weather, after all, does not much determine human behavior. Time budgets are actually similar in Glasgow and Tenerife. Well, we need to take care not to exaggerate the importance of weather or climate for cities. As we've said, humans are cave animals and everywhere spend only an hour or so exposing themselves to bears and ultraviolet. And in large part, we've built cities to isolate ourselves and our prosperity from the environment. High incomes, great longevity, and large population concentrations have, in fact, been achieved in every class of environment on Earth. Americans, for example, manufacture computers both in hot, dry Phoenix and cool, wet Portland. Americans perform heart surgery in humid Houston and snowy Cleveland. In Europe, you grow flowers year-round in the Netherlands and vegetables in Belgium. The metro in Budapest runs regardless of the mud that was a problem in Hungary for 1,000 years. And whether it's Berlin or Bangkok or Singapore, we work in climate-controlled office buildings. So actually, we've insulated travel, communications, energy generation, food availability, and so forth, almost all the major social functions from all but the most extreme environmental conditions of temperature, wind, light and dark, moisture, tides, and seasons. And it's gotten even a bit crazier. About 60 kilometers south of Berlin, a former Soviet airship hangar known as the Arium has become a tropical paradise, actually in 2004. Has 66,000 square meters of floor space and 5 million cubic meters of enclosed space. It's a self-contained holiday destination in the gray heart of Europe, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, can accommodate 6,000 people at a time, and the temperature is always 26 degrees C. The global average temperature is about 15 degrees C, so clearly humanity does like some warming or toasting. Well, for all the poetry about nature, we have basically retreated into walled cities, or in the extreme, into a tropical paradise in central Germany. So we have this kind of weird autarkic world, for better or for worse, that we've chosen through our behavior. And the natural trend seems to be in this direction, to building megalopolis with zones of great density. And very wonderful aspect of this is that it leaves the possibility of creating low-density patches or sanctuaries where people might go when they wish or simply observe through millions of mini cameras placed here and there, including on other animals. And Scotland, in fact, exemplifies this trend. If you look at a national map, you see, well, the average population density in Scotland in 2011 was about 70 people per square kilometer, compared to about 400 in the UK and Holland and 1,000 in Bangladesh. The average figure actually is misleading because 2/3 of Scots live in the Central Belt. Most Scots experience life in a densely populated country, and in fact, Glasgow's density is only about half that of, per square kilometer, is only about half that of Hong Kong. Well, globally and in Scotland, the built environment could grow from 5 or 6% of the land surface today to, say, 10%. But meanwhile, if humanity continues our shift toward a more efficient agriculture, one might say a landless agriculture, then more and more land can be spared for nature. Cities will function essentially as closed systems where most materials, including water, are recycled. The only physical input need be free energy, and the only output heat or negentropy. We can have a highly efficient hydrogen economy running the fuel cells in the cars. We can have hydrogen aircraft as well. We can have industrial systems in which waste virtually disappears. And these can enable large, prosperous human populations to coexist with salmon, wildcats, and golden eagles. The bluebells and the Celtic rainforest can tranquilly regrow for the amusement of naturalists. Ponder the walled city as the prototype of the spaceship we may eventually send to other parts of the universe. So nature can return also in cities themselves. Whales have returned to New York Harbor. This is a humpback whale photographed about a year ago in New York Harbor with the Empire State Building in the background. And in fact, bald eagles are nesting within New York City's limits again. Wild salmon spawned in the Connecticut River near to New York for the first time in 200 years last October. Fox experts estimate that about 10,000 foxes now roam the city of London, more than the number of double-decker buses. They appear to ride the London Underground for free. Well, now let me recap. While the city is not a machine for living, it is a machine for communication through exchange of information, services, and objects, but above all by direct contact among persons. We are still jabbering monkeys grooming one another. In a village, the swarm of exchanges comes in one plaza or one container without specialization. When villages grow into cities, the services and the contacts become hierarchical, and these tend to assemble in the various levels that I've described. The structure permits needed contacts while minimizing distance or time traveled. The cities grow in proportion to the velocity of the means of transport. Organization is not in space, but in time. People travel in time, not in space. And in fact, if you turn to the person next to you and ask, how far do you live from here? The answer you'll get is almost certainly will be in minutes and not in meters. More speed means a larger territory and all the choices it brings for business, education, and leisure. A person on foot can choose among the 1,000 people of the village. The jet set has 1 billion among whom to choose. How to prosper? It's helpful to be early, but not too early with the growing technologies and industries. In transport, we've hinted at what they are, from fuel cells and maglevs, blimps maybe, to drones in various forms and scooters. All the associated technologies matter too, for example, for tunneling and for system control, and a strong aesthetic. Happily, the development of cities permits faster and easier restoration of nature in the rest of the land. Scotland and Glasgow can once again exemplify the good nature of cities, inside and out. As the builders of the fourth rail bridge understood perfectly, the limit to successful cities is low-cost speed. Thank you.
Okay, so before the formal vote of thanks to close the evening, Professor Ausubel has kindly agreed to take some questions, and we have a roving microphone. So if you have a question, you could raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and then you could state your name and a brief question.
Thank you. First of all, Professor, thank you for a really quite brilliant and very thought-provoking presentation there. I was much taken with your comments about Zipf, who I was not aware of, and also you citing 1950 as when the cars determining the dimensions, the borders of cities. Glasgow, of course, unfortunately offers a salutary experience of now how not to handle that. Much of its approach was to clear and depopulate its older neighbourhoods and move the almost nil car ownership populations to large peripheral estates. At a stroke, it virtually ended Glasgow as functioning as a highly populated, highly walkable city. The question I wanted to ask you was, I found your observations in airports almost provocative. I think at one point you said airports may well become the new town centres, and they are already the buckle of intercity connectivity. Given that, can one imply then that from a regional city perspective in the UK, it is indeed airports, that's the name of the game, especially in a European context, and that therefore the UK's High Speed 2 giant rail infrastructure project is not at all an appropriate way to enter into the future, and may well end up one of those grand political vanity projects in the great British tradition?
I don't know much about the British plans. As I sort of say, coming from a great distance and thinking first about Scotland, I would say, again, job number, there's a hierarchy of needs. Number one is to connect the airport to the city center in 10 minutes so that the airport does not replace the city center as the city center, unless you want it to. Airports have infinite parking, rental cars, they now have enormous amounts of shopping. Industry is also, all the logistics industries are relocating around the airport. So the fluxes through airports will be bigger and bigger. So if one doesn't want in that sense, the center of power to shift entirely to the geographical area around the airport, the number one job is to connect the center city to the airport in 10 minutes. I would say number two job is to connect Edinburgh and Glasgow airports also in about 10 minutes so that the two airports function as two terminals of Heathrow, so to say. So if people need to fly or switch between one and the other, they can do so, but also so that people wanting to get quickly from having taken the train from Haymarket to Glasgow yesterday morning. It's a lovely ride, but if I were really trying to do business or to go to school, it's too slow. And so I would try to connect the two airports very high speed and allow them to form one airport in effect and form a larger catchment area for all the services. Then there's the question of London, which is both the capital of the UK and a world city. So one has to rethink the relationship to London. Anything that takes more than 60 minutes to get to London will be worthless. So if the so-called, this is what Elon Musk recognized in California, the plan that the governor of California was proposing was for a 2.5-hour train ride each way, which is faster than the current 4.5 or 5-hour train ride, but it wouldn't compete successfully with air. So I would say I would look for a real high-speed link to London. ignoring what I've learned is now being called the Northern Powerhouse. That's irrelevant. Every stop just takes 10 minutes. I wouldn't stop in Manchester or Liverpool or Birmingham. I would just focus on London and make sure you have a trip at least as fast as the present air trip. So preferably using, I would say, well, it has to be maglev because of the distance. You don't need the low pressure maglev. You could just have a conventional maglev, the kind the Japanese are building between Tokyo and Osaka, for example. That would do that from the airports to London, and then that allows you to relieve an enormous amount of the pressure on the airports because 30% of the flights and the passengers are just going to London. So here you'd have, in effect, a metro connection to London, or it could be a mix of Luton and Heathrow and Gatwick, whatever. And then I would, particularly if Britain withdraws from Europe, as a Scot, I would want to multiply my contacts with Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Berlin, possibly Berlin. I'd say Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris would be a bit more important. And I would immediately replace all the flights that are going to London with flights to what you would want to regard as your counterpart cities. And then if Britain stays in the EU, you have the fast links to London. If Britain leaves the EU, you have you've made a whole set of new relationships that work at the level. So I'm not sure that answers your question. That would be my own. But as we were discussing very much today, the world never works in this top-down way. Things are much more complicated in practice. But
hi there. Again, I enjoyed your talk, Professor. When you look at John F. Kennedy's speeches back in 1963, he was kind of predicting 100 million people population in the United States in the 1990s, if you look at some of the clips. It's interesting how Americans look into the future, whereas Europeans, British people as well, we tend to look in the past. But when we look at London now, with Heathrow Airport and the third runway, this has become a political decision. Whether that's going to go ahead or not, and that's going to have an effect on some of what you're talking about tonight. Again, where I come from, which is the east of England, we have Robin Hood Airport there, and if there is a decision not to go ahead with the third runway, could those other runways around London, Robin Hood or Gatwick or Stansted, take some of that traffic and actually not emphasize speed, but go the opposite way of what you're saying, actually slow down?
Well, I think a set of airports can work as well as a single very large one. And some cities like Atlanta have gone for a very, very large consolidated airport. Some cities, New York has 3 airports or even 4, depending how you count. So London has 4, even 5, if you count the city airport as well. You can have multiple airports as long as you connect the airports at high speed. I think the weakness in the thinking in London, the airports are competing to be faster to get to the center city. So Luton wants to have a faster link to the center city, and faster than Gatwick or faster than Heathrow. That's a good thing to do. But really what you want to do is have I'd say, a high-speed ring that links the airports and gives you much more flexibility and allows, whether it's passengers or freight, the option of using the whole system. So I don't, in that sense, I don't think the decision about any particular runway needs to be that important. I would say it's the linkage of the airports themselves which I would give higher priority to. The whole question of London and world cities is a little different from the questions that I was addressing, because aviation has made the world, in a sense, there's one jet set. So, and a small number of cities, New York, London, Tokyo, perhaps Beijing, compete to be at the top of the hierarchy of world cities. And that's a somewhat different game to play. So there's a lot to be said about that as well. But I think from the point of view of this region in Scotland, I think that there are three challenges. One is the internal. Second is the link to London, which is still going to be the largest, the most significant regional partner, whatever. And then, but the other is to finesse the relationship to England with faster, more direct contacts with the continent.
Thank you very much, Professor Ausubel. You prompted loads of questions in my mind, but I'll stick to one for now anyway. Looking forwards to population growth, it's predicted that it'll be about 9.5 billion of us by 2050, which is up by about 2.3 on the current population. But more strikingly, the population of cities will grow by 2.5 billion by that time. Now that's about another 80 cities the size of Tokyo. Is this going to be the kind of inflating of existing cities as they exist at the moment, or is it going to be by building brand new cities for that population which currently are in places that don't have a city? And if so, what are the challenges facing each of those as you see it?
Again, I think we'll end up with hierarchies of cities. The two most important areas are India and Eastern China. There will be, if the cities build high-speed transportation within the area, I think we can look forward to whatever you want to call them, conurbations, urban regions with as many as 50 million people. If the transport is slow, they'll stay or whatever around 8 to 10 million, which has been where many cities have been getting stuck. Then the question again is how you connect those. India is about the size of the United States east of the Mississippi with 4 times as many people. The density is incredible. Again, the thought of flocks of A380s taking off from Chennai and landing in Hyderabad during monsoon season, whatever, it boggles the mind. I think again, this is a long-range vision, but I think for India, having a continental scale maglev metro is what makes sense. You know, you can have long trains shuffling enormous numbers of people between all the pairs of cities. They can be underground, or India has a very highly developed rail system, so it could be on the rights of way above the current rail system. And I'd say the same for Eastern China. China has been investing a lot in its airports, and the airports have improved, but again, they're flying 1 or 2 seconds a day. And if you just do very simple arithmetic, the expansion of the air system that would be needed, I think, is even for enthusiastic engineers, as here at the university and in this room, I think the idea of only using larger and faster aircraft would be very hard. We worked on that a little bit. The only really clever idea we had, this was also about 20 years ago, was to make a system of tubes. In airports, instead of boarding the aircraft, you would have tubes, tin cans, so to say, or it could be like a metro car, subway car, and people would board the car, and then that car would be injected into an airplane. And you could imagine a system that would be much more efficient, because as soon as you arrived at the airport, for example, you could get into your canister, and 1,000 people get, it would be much more like loading subways.
The maglev question, this was one of my other thoughts. The graph that you showed went from canals to rail to road to air, and those 4 strike me as a development in terms of increasing degrees of freedom. You know, on the canal boat, you go where the canal goes, and railways are maybe slightly more flexible, but pretty much the same. Roads give you a great deal more freedom of movement as an individual. You choose where you drive to, and air is even a further degree of freedom. You're not restricted by rivers or other bodies of water. But the maglev is back to the canal in terms of restricting you to one degree of freedom. You go where the vacuum tube goes. So do you really think it will get over that hurdle in terms of becoming a valid mode of transport?
Well, I think the air has, the genius of air is the point-to-point. I think the greatest potential for maglev is where there's enormous traffic. So if you take Tokyo, Osaka, Sao Paulo, Rio, London, Paris, New York, Boston, Washington, that's where to begin and develop the system where the investment can be profitable. There's a tendency, most famous in the UK, to overbuild the new infrastructures. So of course most of the people who invested in canals lost money. Most of the people who invested in railways, there was overshoot, too many small spurs were built. We certainly shouldn't make that mistake with the maglevs. It's great to experiment with going from the airport to the city center or with a roller coaster and an amusement park. But if you're really going to invest, it should be Tokyo, Osaka, or Central Belt to London, or London to Paris. And I think, again, a lot of the idea of the maglev is that it could take some of the heaviest trunk routes and relax the pressure on the airports.
Maybe one final question. We have one?
How expensive is maglev to build, and how expensive is it to travel on at the moment? So does it compete on price?
It's a very hard question to answer. A lot of the development investment in Japan has been, I would say, opaque in government budgets, partly some of it's done by Japan National Railways, but some of it is for purposes of getting out of a recession or for maintaining a position of technological leadership. The Koreans, who are, I would say, are being more entrepreneurial about it, and are also building some legs and would like to export. So I would say, if you wanted to look at some perhaps more realistic estimates of construction per passenger per kilometer, or expenses per passenger kilometer, one might look at some of the Korean experiences, but I don't think we really know yet. Tunneling is expensive. The surface systems could be built. The Elon Musk Hyperloop system, there are a number of estimates you can see on the internet. It's cheap, and one of his arguments is that his plan, there are two alternate plans, each of which is substantially cheaper than the high-speed rail concept being talked about in the California state government. What would finally be charged? Well, the fare would probably be 10% less than the airfare or 10% more than the airfare. I doubt it would be a cost-based charge to the passenger. It'll depend on what the competing alternatives are. I would say, finally, again, if society continues to become richer, a couple of percent a year, we're talking about things that may happen in 30, 40, 50 years, the society will be substantially wealthier. So in the same way that we've been able to afford rail or cars or planes, this would be occurring against a background in which income levels have risen. So not tenfold, but let's say they've doubled. So I think if we just expect a permanent recession for the next 30 years and obviously this isn't going to happen. This is a vision that does depend on some continuing or resumption of growth, or maybe this is the way to propel the growth.
It's also maybe worth noting, yesterday at the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery we saw the model of the Binney rail plane from 1932. I think it was with the test track outside of Mulgai. So Scotland's had its own experience of novel high-speed hyperloop type transportation, which is retrofitted on top of the old steam railways. But unfortunately, I think the Binney rail plane was way ahead of its time. But so maybe for the Glasgow-Edinburgh link, we can use our heritage of engineering inventiveness for new ways to connect the city. Now I ask Professor Paul Younger, the Ranking Chair of Engineering here at the University of Glasgow, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Well, I'll not keep you long because there's some wine waiting for you outside. So now that I've told you that, I'll have to stay brief. And before I do the vote of thanks to Jesse, I'd like first to thank Professor Colin McInnes, who holds the James Watt Chair in Engineering and Science here, whose brainchild, not just this public lecture, but the whole of today. We've had a fantastic workshop on future cities, and I think everyone who was there came away extremely stimulated. We had a very diverse bunch of presentations and very lively discussions across a full range of topics that have been very much reflected in what Professor Ausubel has treated us to this evening. So thanks to Colin for thinking of that, and Gary Mushet for doing a lot of the organising. It's been a fantastic day. I personally have learned a great deal from the lecture this evening, and also from an earlier presentation where we were given a bit of a teaser of some of this by Professor Ausubel. I now go away well and truly informed that some of the previous cliches that we hear about spatial things, such as a country is more an idea than a place. That's one sort of cliche that you sometimes hear trotted out. Another would be, it's better to be travelling than to arrive. Well, I've learned for sure that the commuter says no on that one. So the definition of city has definitely changed for me, because it's been underlined very eloquently by Professor Ausubel in his lecture tonight, which quite patently, if you didn't know anything of his illustrious track record, it's quite patent. How much this is based on decades of intensive research and deep thinking about these things. And it boils down eventually, as most really profound things do, to some quite simple statements. People travel in time, not space, So people say to me, how far do you live from the city centre? About 25 minutes, Yeah, I give it units of time. It does depend whether I go on the bus or the bike or walk. But I tend to go on the bike. Actually, it's quicker than the bus, which probably says something about us getting public transport wrong in our city, let alone between here and the other city, only 45 miles away. And that the limit to the growth of successful cities is low-cost speed, i.e. transport, not the not the stuff you can buy on the streets, dodgy parts of town to give yourself a cheap high. So the limit to successful cities is low-cost speed. And really, what we've heard about cities tonight, there's a great depth of richness in all of this, which inevitably, given such a vast topic to cover, Professor Ausubel has had to get the main lessons over to us, and sort of drive them home, that a city is better measured with a stopwatch than with a ruler. But also he touched on, some key issues for us, innovations in transport technology, to make it possible, for us to really take on board that really it all comes down to the travel time budget, but also the importance of entrepreneurship, and to try and resist the temptation, which I think is certainly where I grew up. Entrepreneur was used as a term of abuse for people we'd never met. I came across it in one or two sort of bitter songs when I was growing up. you know, so this attitude of you know, scorning and discouraging the entrepreneur is certainly something we need to get rid of where I'm from, and I think some of those same attitudes are also current in Scotland today, because I'm from not a million miles from Scotland, as you can probably tell. Professor Ausubel also talked about it being essential that, you know, the densification of cities is accompanied by an appropriate beautification and an appropriate respect for the need for personal space, and held out to us a future in which we might have closed systems in our cities where we manage to see to most of the production of the things we need within the city limits. I think that's certainly a tall order with the inherited infrastructure that we already have. And one of the big questions for us in the old cities like this, or the old city that Professor Ausubel comes from and has huge affection for, New York, is how we retrofit greater sustainability into our cities. And we've been given a huge amount of food for thought, which is terrific. But food, of course, should not be consumed for too long without drink. So I'm going to invite you all to have a glass of wine outside in a minute. But before that, I'm going to give Professor Ausubel, if Professor McInnes wouldn't mind acting as my glamorous assistant, a little something to drink on his way back to New York.